So Little Village Environmental Justice Organization is an organization on the southwest side of Chicago. We primarily deal with environmental issues in our community with the overall goal that we are entitled as a community to a healthy environment, clean air, clean water, clean land, and the right to make decisions about what happens in our community, when, where, and how it comes about. In the United States, the EJ movement is clear that our communities of color, indigenous people, and low income are either already experiencing the earliest impacts of climate change or will experience the most significant impacts. These current and future impact disparities result from the disproportionate burden of pollution and health disparities that environmental justice communities bear as a result of the inequitable concentration of noxious facilities and undesirable land uses in our neighborhood. So for example, in Alaska, communities near the Arctic Circle are already experiencing the impacts of climate change through shore erosion or lower water levels in lakes and rivers. Communities in the southern U.S. are experiencing severe droughts. In the west, we see the wildfire season, and in the Midwest, our annual precipitation has increased substantially. So with that said, beyond holding the dubious distinction of being amongst those who will be worst hit by climate change, residents in communities of color, indigenous people, and low-income communities, by definition, have fewer resources to move and adapt to climate change. If the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and Rita taught us nothing else, it should be the adverse impacts of climate change fall heaviest on our communities. While science is clear and the time for action is now, we have yet to get national legislation to address the most pressing issue of our day, to produce the reductions in greenhouse gases caused by slow global warming. We must phase out the use of extraction of fossil fuels. Our current reliance on fossil fuels for power generation and transportation, particularly for use of coal-burning plants, accounts almost a third of national emissions of carbon dioxide, one of the primary greenhouse gases. So as an environmental justice community, we are not in favor of cap and trade. It is a system that lacks transparency. It's a system that not only doesn't address the issues that we have in our communities, but one of the other problems with cap and trade is it doesn't deal with things like co-pollutants. So when you're dealing with a coal power plant and you're cutting CO2, a lot of times you're not looking at the reduction of particulate matter, which is one of the heaviest things that causes deaths in our communities. You're not looking at things like SOx and NOx. You're not looking at things like mercury and lead. You're only looking at the major pollutants that are coming out of these plants. And in a lot of our communities, we don't just have coal power plants. We have asphalt companies that put out a lot of particulate matter. We have a lot of smaller industry that puts out a lot of small potatoes, if you will, if you're looking at emissions on a ranking level like cap and trade does. So for us as a community, this only deals with one of a list of items that are currently in our air in our community. One of the other issues that we have is the lack of the voice of our communities. Communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous communities are not at the table talking to these legislators, or they're not being heard about what their opinion on the cap and trade system is. This is a system that was created off of marketing, a system that puts pollution into a marketing scheme. If half of us aren't even investing in the current Wall Street, what makes us think that we're going to have anything to do with the investment of cap and trade? Our voices are not being heard at this table. Asian, Black, Latino, and Native American communities in the U.S., as well as indigenous and poor people around the world, disproportionately bear the negative economic, environmental, and health impacts of fossil fuel economy at every stage of its life cycle, including exploration, extraction, production, refining, distribution, consumption, and disposal of its waste. When looking at the cap and trade system, we're not looking at all of those things. We're not looking at the life cycle of a lot of these things. When we're talking about coal, the coal plant is separate from mountaintop removal, which is separate from the ash at the end of the process. What we need to be doing is looking at these cycles for what they are. They're cycles of life. If you're going to be permitting coal, let's start from the beginning of where you're getting your coal to following it through the end of where you are putting your garbage from the coal power plant. And that's one of the issues, again, that we have with the cap and trade system. Global climate change caused by burning fossil fuels, resulting in the release of carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases, and associated co-pollutants into our oceans, air, soil, and vegetation, jeopardizes the plant's ability to maintain a livable climate and causes grave health problems in poor communities, communities of color, and indigenous communities. Some of the things that we saw in the European Union emission trading scheme was that economic globalization steers international commodities markets to manufacture and privatize the rights to dispose of greenhouse gases and their co-pollutants into the air, oceans, soil and vegetation, and human bodies, and is in direct conflict with the true human rights of people and respect for our planet. You also have the ability to give billions of dollars worth of these rights free of charge to the biggest corporate emitters of greenhouse gases. Therefore, you're creating a bigger divide between low income, middle income, and the rest of the world. You're not allowing for energy efficiency and clean renewable energies to be able to be funded and marketed. And you're also creating huge carbon dumps across the world. So the lack of transparency, as I mentioned, is one of the biggest issues that we have with this issue. And lastly, the fact that carbon trading is undemocratic because it allows entrenched polluters, market designers, and commodity traders to determine whether and where to reduce greenhouse gases and co-pollutant emissions without allowing impacted communities or governments to participate in those decisions. So when you're talking about a cap and trade system, you're not just talking about worsening the environment, you're talking about worsening the economic divide, you're talking about worsening the job divide, you're talking about worsening a lot of the issues that we currently have within any justice movement, not just the environmental justice movement. You know, you're talking about causing more and more divide amongst classes and races in our communities. So what are we looking for? We're looking for greenhouse gases that will be substantially reduced only through a transition to greater energy efficiency and sustainable energy technologies that do not rely on fossil fuels. Capturing energy from the wind, sun, ocean, and heat stored within the Earth's crust builds the health and self-reliance of people in our communities, protects the planet, creates jobs, and expands the global economy. Global energy transformation is the politically unifying and inclusive principle that affirms the rights of all people, including the poor, women, rural, and indigenous communities, to have access to affordable and sustainable energy and enhanced quality of life that such access affords. So for us as an organization, we feel that we will fight at every turn at all efforts to establish a system of carbon trading and offset. We demand for real change in a way that makes the use of our energy, our demands for real changes in the way we make and use energy will not be silenced by promises of money or token adjustments to the fundamentally flawed trading and offsets approach. And we stand with communities around the world in opposition of carbon trading and offset use and the continued over-reliance on fossil fuels. We support conservation, regulatory, and other measures to address greenhouse gases only if they directly and significantly reduce emissions, require the shift away from use of fossil fuels and nuclear power, and do not cause or exacerbate the pollution burden of poor communities of color in the U.S. and developing nations around the world. So these are two documents that were made by the environmental justice communities at large, organizations that have come together that don't have folks working on cap and trade. We don't have somebody working on cap and trade. We just went out with our organizers and did our homework, found out what it meant to our community, and established our opinion that we weren't at the table when this was created. It's going to kill our communities even more. All it does is make give industry more power and make them richer and make our communities suffer even more. And that's not something that we can stand behind. And what we found was that more and more communities felt the same way we did. So anywhere from California to Chicago to New York, you will find organizations that, again, aren't doing anything on cap and trade, but feel a need to unify under this constitution, if you will, of climate justice and say, we will not stand for our communities to be impacted anymore, and we will not stand for people to profit off of our health and off of the bad environment that we live in.